When my daughter-in-law told me to leave, I smiled instead of crying. It wasn't because I was strong or unfeeling. It was something quieter, deeper. Perhaps it was a mix of disbelief, hurt, and the faintest whisper of hope that things might not be as bad as they seemed. I had spent decades raising my children, guiding them, loving them in ways I never thought I would have to explain. And yet, there I stood, being told I was no longer welcome in my own home. The house smelled of old wood and polish, with faint traces of the meals I had cooked that morning. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet spaces between the words I didn't know how to respond with. My hands were trembling slightly, but my smile was steady. It was a smile that spoke of patience, endurance, and a quiet dignity. I wanted them to see that I was not defeated, though inside, a part of me ached in ways words could never capture. I took a slow breath and remembered the early mornings of my life. The tiny hands of my children clutching mine as they took their first steps. The way their laughter would echo through the rooms like music. The nights spent rocking them to sleep when the world outside felt cold and harsh. I had imagined growing old surrounded by that same warmth, by the familiar sounds of family. But now, it seemed that warmth was slipping away, and I was left to face a quiet house and heavier thoughts. I did not walk away immediately. I stayed there in the doorway, letting the rain outside tap against the windows, letting the quiet sink in. I wanted to understand. How had things come to this point? When had my children's hearts become distant? And when had my love, which had always been unconditional, turned into something they no longer needed or appreciated? Our family had never been perfect. There were small misunderstandings, little arguments over chores, over school choices, over money, but they had never felt like walls. There had always been room for discussion, for compromise, for laughter that erased the sting of disagreement. And yet, I had failed somewhere along the way. Perhaps I had been too quiet, too patient, or maybe I had believed in the wrong idea of family. My daughter-in-law's eyes were firm, unyielding. I could see no softness there, no trace of empathy, not even the slightest glimmer of hesitation. "It's better if you leave," she said again, her voice calm, almost too calm. That was the hardest part, the calmness. Anger or shouting could have been faced. It could have been argued with, explained. Calm words had no escape, no room for debate. They were final, like a door closing slowly but firmly on everything I had known. I stepped back and let her words settle. I smiled again, this time not just to hide the pain, but because I needed to remind myself that I had lived a life full of love and kindness, and that even in moments like this, there was still a chance to find peace. Perhaps the world could be cruel, but my heart could remain soft. Perhaps my children could forget, but I would not forget the love I had given. Thinking back, our home had always been a place of warmth. Even when money was tight, or when small illnesses kept us awake at night, we had moments of joy. Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and laughter, evenings where we would sit together and talk about school or dreams, small celebrations that never needed gifts. These were the threads that wove the fabric of our family. And I had believed, maybe naively, that these threads would hold forever. Now, the threads felt fragile, stretched thin by time, misunderstandings, and the quiet drift of priorities. My husband, God rest his soul, had passed years ago, leaving me to navigate these later years mostly alone. I thought my children would step in naturally, without me asking, to share those quiet moments of care, to check in, to remind me that family wasn't just about being together when it was convenient. I had hoped they would visit often, call regularly, sit and drink tea with me as we watched the world go by. But life had moved fast for them. Work, marriages, children of their own, responsibilities piled on responsibilities. And in the shuffle, our home, once a sanctuary of laughter, had become a place they no longer prioritized. I understood that, I told myself. I tried to understand, but when the words, "It's better if you leave," came, I realized that understanding had its limits. There are moments in life when even the deepest empathy cannot bridge a gap built by neglect. I thought of my mornings, the quiet moments I spent making breakfast, tidying the house, arranging flowers in the vase by the window. These small acts had always been expressions of love. And yet, now they were unseen, unappreciated. I realized painfully that my presence, which had always been a source of comfort, had become something that others found inconvenient. And so I stood there in the gentle hum of the kitchen, listening to the rain, feeling the weight of years of love, care, and sacrifice. I remembered my mother, who had faced similar struggles with dignity. I remembered the words she had whispered to me on her last day. Even if they forget, you must remember. And I understood, in that moment, that my path forward required patience, courage, and a quiet acceptance that love is not always returned in the way we expect. I smiled one last time that morning, took a slow breath, and decided to step into this new reality with my head held high. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I promised myself that even if my children had forgotten their parents, I would not forget the family we had built together. That love, that memory, was mine to hold, and it would carry me forward, gently, quietly, with hope that maybe, just maybe, hearts could change with time. The days after that morning felt strange. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Every sound, from the ticking clock to the hum of the refrigerator, seemed louder than usual, reminding me that something in our family had shifted. I moved slowly through the rooms, my hands trailing over the furniture, as if to remember its familiar shakes. The walls, which had always been witnesses to laughter, conversations, and tears, now seemed to hold a quiet judgment. I tried to reach out. I sent small messages to my children, hoping for warmth or even a simple acknowledgement. I hope you're all well, thinking of you. That was all. Short, gentle words meant to remind them that I was still here, still present. But the replies were brief, almost perfunctory. Busy. We'll call later. Take care. Words that were polite but distant, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. I remember one afternoon, my daughter came by with her little ones. The children ran through the house, their laughter filling the space, and for a moment, I felt that familiar joy return. I poured tea for all of us, set the table with care, and tried to catch up on their lives. But even in that moment of closeness, I noticed the hurried glances, the constant checking of phones, the subtle reminders that they had other things to do, other lives to attend to. "Grandma, can we go play outside?" one of the children asked, tugging at my sleeve. I smiled and nodded, but as I opened the door to the yard, I noticed my daughter's watchful eyes. There was no warmth in the way she observed me, only a quiet impatience. I tried not to take it personally, but it stung. The house, which had once been alive with conversations that stretched into the evening, now seemed like a waiting room, a place where I existed, but only as long as it did not interfere with their schedules. Even my son, the one I had raised with so much care, seemed distant. He visited less and less often, always with a sense of hurry, always with a polite but constrained smile. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" he would ask. And I could hear the routine in his voice, as though he was reading from a script rather than speaking from the heart. I wanted to reach for his hand, to hug him like I used to when he was a boy, but he would pull away subtly, as if some invisible wall had been built between us. I tried to remind myself that life changes, that people get busy, and that perhaps their distance was not meant to hurt me. But when I poured my heart into small gestures, when I tried to connect with stories, memories, or advice, I could feel the polite detachment, the subtle avoidance, and the unspoken message that I was intruding. One evening, I decided to cook a special dinner, hoping it would bring us together. I made their favorite dishes, the ones I had perfected over years, and arranged the table with care. I waited for them to arrive, And when they did, the atmosphere was polite but cold. My son glanced at his watch several times. My daughter-in-law spoke softly, almost dismissively. I tried to carry the conversation, asking about work, about the children, about small things, but it felt as though the words hit an invisible barrier. After dinner, as I cleared the plates, my daughter-in-law spoke quietly. "Mom, maybe it's time we discuss our living arrangements." I froze for a moment, holding a plate in my hands. The gentle clinking of china seemed loud in the quiet room. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted to, but the words tangled in my throat. Finally, I said softly, "I thought I was welcome here." She looked down, her voice firm yet calm. "You are, but it's complicated. We have our routines, and it's hard to manage everything with so many responsibilities. Maybe you could consider other arrangements." I nodded slowly, swallowing a lump in my throat. I wanted to argue, to tell her about all the years I had given, about the nights I had stayed awake caring for their illnesses, about the meals, the love, the countless little sacrifices no one noticed. But instead, I said nothing. I realized then that words, no matter how heartfelt, sometimes fall short. Sometimes silence is all you have, and patience becomes your only companion. The following weeks were a series of quiet, unspoken tensions. I tried to keep my routine simple. I would wake early, make tea, do the dishes, sweep the floors, and try to find comfort in the small rhythms of daily life. Yet even in those simple tasks, I felt the absence of connection. The hollow space left by children who had once been so near and now felt so far. One morning, as I sat by the window, watching the rain fall softly on the garden, I realized that the house, my sanctuary, had become a mirror of my feelings. The empty rooms reflected my loneliness. The quiet hallways echoed my unanswered questions, and the walls seemed to whisper about the moments I had missed with my children, the stories I had hoped to share, and the closeness I had taken for granted. Even small gestures from them became a source of conflict in my heart. A phone call that lasted only a few words, a visit that felt rushed, a smile that seemed polite but distant. Each one reminded me that something fundamental had shifted, something I could neither control nor fully understand. I tried to remind myself that love is patient, that children grow up and create their own worlds. But the ache of exclusion was constant, lingering like a shadow I could not shake. And yet, amid this tension, I held on to the memories. The evenings when we cooked together, the birthdays, the long walks in the park, the bedtime stories. I clung to them like a lifeline, a reminder that the foundation of love I had built was still real, even if now it was being tested. I reminded myself that I had done everything I could, and perhaps the rest was beyond my reach. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when laughter returned, when my grandchildren hugged me tightly, or when my son paused to share a memory, or when my daughter-in-law spoke kindly. I felt the fragile threads of family connection stirring again. But they were brief, fragile, and often followed by silence, distance, or unspoken disappointment. I began keeping a small journal, writing down my thoughts, my feelings, and my fears. Each entry became a quiet conversation with myself, a way to process the complex emotions swirling inside me. I wrote about love, loss, hope, and longing. I wrote about the days I had raised my children with care, about the sacrifices I had made, and about the quiet hope that maybe, someday, they would understand. Through it all, I learned that rising conflict is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, and persistent. Sometimes it is felt in the absence of words, in the fleeting gestures, in the polite but distant smiles. And sometimes the greatest strength is in the quiet endurance, in holding your heart open, even when it feels as though the world is closing in around you. Weeks passed in a quiet rhythm, each day blending into the next. I moved through the house, performing the familiar tasks I had done for years, sweeping the floors, making tea, tidying up the kitchen. Yet with every small act, I felt the absence of warmth. My children were present in the house, physically, but their hearts seemed elsewhere. And then came the day that changed everything. The moment when the quiet tension became something I could no longer ignore. It was a Sunday afternoon, a day that had once been filled with laughter and togetherness. I had spent the morning preparing a simple lunch, setting the table with care, hoping that my children would sit and share even a small conversation. The rain tapped lightly on the windows, a soft rhythm that usually brought calm. But that day, the sound seemed ominous, like a quiet drum signaling the approaching storm. My son arrived first, carrying his briefcase, already distracted by messages on his phone. He greeted me politely, with a nod and a small smile, but it lacked the warmth I remembered. My daughter-in-law followed, her expression unreadable, her movements brisk. She set down a bag and began unpacking items, as if the house were just a temporary stop in her day. My heart sank slightly, but I tried to remain calm. I reminded myself that people have busy lives, that children grow up and create their own routines. We sat down to eat, and the conversation was polite but stilted. Small talk about work, the weather, the children's school. I asked about their lives, gently, hoping for some connection, some spark of the closeness we had once shared. But the answers were short, almost rehearsed. Each word felt like a barrier rather than a bridge. After lunch, as I began clearing the table, my daughter-in-law spoke quietly, almost without looking at me. "Mom, we need to talk," she said. I paused, holding a plate in my hands, feeling a cold weight settle in my chest. I had anticipated tension, yes, but nothing had prepared me for the words that followed. "We've been discussing the house, and we feel it's time for you to consider moving out," she said, her voice calm, measured. The words hit me like a sudden gust of wind, knocking the breath from me. I wanted to argue, to remind them of the love and care I had poured into this home. But the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I held the plate tightly, letting the silence stretch between us. My son spoke next, his tone gentle but firm. "Mom, it's not that we don't care. We do. But with our schedules, the kids, work, it's hard to manage everything. We thought maybe a smaller place, somewhere closer to town, would be better for you." I looked at him, searching for empathy, for understanding, for even a hint of the boy I had once known. But his eyes were steady, detached, like he was speaking to a stranger rather than his own mother. I felt a quiet storm building inside me. Not anger, not shouting, but a deep, aching sadness that wrapped itself around my chest like a heavy blanket. I wanted to cry, to beg, to explain, but something in me held back. I realized then that this was more than a request. It was a decision that had already been made without me, a silent erasure of my place in the family I had built. I see," I said softly, finally breaking the silence. My voice was calm, but inside it trembled. "I understand that life is busy, that everyone has responsibilities. I only hoped that love would be enough to keep us together." They said nothing in response. The quiet stretched between us, filled with unspoken words, regrets, and the weight of years. I looked around the house, at the familiar walls, the furniture, the memories etched into every corner. And I realized that love, no matter how strong, sometimes cannot hold a family together when priorities shift, when convenience outweighs care, when the heart grows distant. That evening, after they left, I sat alone in the living room, the rain falling softly outside, and I thought about the years I had spent raising my children. The sleepless nights, the illnesses, the celebrations, the small moments of joy that had woven our family together. And now, it felt as though all of it had been forgotten, replaced by polite distance and quiet exclusion. I began to understand that the turning point was not just the words they spoke, but the realization that some things could not be fixed with reminders or gentle persuasion. The world I had imagined, where love was enough, had shifted, and I had to find a way to navigate this new reality, to hold on to my dignity and my heart, even as the home felt emptier than ever before. Over the following days, I packed small things, photos, letters, mementos, into boxes. Not because I wanted to leave in anger, but because I needed to accept that my presence was no longer a priority for them. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching familiar objects, remembering the laughter that had once filled these spaces. Each step felt heavy, each memory bittersweet. I thought about my mother again, the way she had faced similar challenges with quiet grace. Even if they forget, she had said, you must remember. Those words echoed in my mind as I continued to sort through the remnants of a life shared with my children. I realized that memory, love, and patience would be my companions now, even in the face of rejection. One afternoon, I found a letter tucked away in an old drawer. It was written by my son when he was a boy, full of messy handwriting and boundless affection. He had written about his dreams, his fears, and his love for me. Reading it brought tears to my eyes. I clutched the paper to my chest and whispered softly, I remember. I always will. And in that moment, I understood something profound. That even if my children had turned away, even if the warmth of daily life had cooled, the love I had given, the care I had poured, and the memories we had shared could not be taken away. They were mine, permanent and unbroken, carried quietly in my heart. That night, as I sat by the window watching the rain fall, I realized that turning points are never sudden. They are gentle, quiet, creeping realizations that life is changing, and that sometimes the strength to endure comes not from confrontation, but from calm acceptance, reflection, and the hope that one day hearts might heal. I resolved then to carry myself with dignity, to cherish the memories that no one could take from me, and to hold my heart open, not in expectation, but in quiet hope. Even if my children had forgotten, I would remember. Even if the house felt emptier, I would fill my days with small joys, with the memories that sustained me, and with the patient love that had always been my guiding light. The days that followed the turning point were quiet, almost painfully so. I moved through the house with a kind of careful attention, performing the daily tasks I had always done, but now they felt heavier, slower, as if the air itself was thicker. I cooked my meals in silence, swept the floors with deliberate patience, and arranged the flowers in the vase by the window, taking solace in the small, ordinary rhythms that still belonged to me. Evenings were the hardest. The house, once alive with chatter, laughter, and footsteps, now felt vast and empty. I would sit by the window, watching the rain trace lazy paths down the glass, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. In those moments, I allowed myself to feel everything I had held back: the sadness, the disappointment, the ache of being overlooked. But I also reminded myself of something I had learned long ago, that endurance is a quiet, steady flame that keeps you warm when the world feels cold. I began to spend more time in reflection. I took out old photographs, letters, and keepsakes, and allowed memories to wash over me. There were pictures of birthdays, school plays, family vacations, simple everyday moments of laughter and love. I let myself smile, even laugh quietly, remembering how the house had once been alive with joy. I realized that these memories were my inheritance, the proof of a life fully lived, and that no one could take them away from me. One afternoon, as I sorted through a box of letters, I found a note from my daughter-in-law from years ago. It was small, almost easily overlooked, but the words were kind. She had thanked me for something simple, perhaps a meal or a kind word. But reading it reminded me that love and appreciation had existed here once. And though it had faded, it had not disappeared entirely. That small glimmer was enough to remind me that hearts can change, slowly, quietly, over time. I also began writing again. I filled a journal with my thoughts, my fears, my hopes, and the lessons I had learned. I wrote about patience, about love that endures even when it is unreturned, and about the quiet dignity of accepting reality without bitterness. Writing became a lifeline, a gentle companion that allowed me to process the pain, to acknowledge it fully, and then to set it down, just for a moment, before moving forward. There were small gestures from my children, moments that, though brief, reminded me of the bond we shared. A text message to check in, a phone call that lasted longer than expected, a visit that included a smile that felt genuine. These were not frequent, and they were never perfect, but they were enough to remind me that love, even when strained, still exists. I learned to hold these small moments close, to cherish them without demanding more than they could give. I began to explore new routines for myself. I took walks in the mornings, breathing in the fresh air, noticing the simple beauty of the world around me. I tended to the garden, feeling a quiet satisfaction as plants grew and bloomed under my care. I made tea for myself in the afternoons, sitting by the window and letting the soft light of the sun warm my hands. These small acts of self-care were not indulgent. They were necessary. They reminded me that even in moments of loneliness, life continues, and there is beauty to be found if one is willing to see it. One evening, as I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea, I thought about forgiveness. I realized that forgiving my children, forgiving myself, and forgiving the circumstances did not mean that I accepted neglect or that I excused the pain. It simply meant that I released the weight of anger and resentment from my heart. I could carry love without carrying bitterness. I could remember without being hurt anew every day. I also reached out to friends I had lost touch with over the years. I made calls, invited people over for tea, and allowed myself to accept kindness and company from those outside my immediate family. It was a slow process, but the warmth returned in different ways. Through shared stories, quiet laughter, and small, meaningful connections. And then came a moment that felt almost like a small miracle. One afternoon, my son called, his voice softer than usual. "Mom, I was thinking about the old times. I'd like to visit, maybe just spend some time together." I could feel the hesitation in his words, the nervousness that came from realizing a distance had grown. I didn't respond with relief or expectation. I responded with calm warmth, saying, "I'd like that. Whenever you're ready, you're always welcome." That simple exchange brought a quiet peace I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't a resolution in the dramatic sense. It wasn't a sudden restoration of everything lost. But it was enough to remind me that healing often comes gently, in small steps, and that patience can be more powerful than confrontation. I spent the following days preparing for his visit, not with anxiety, but with thoughtful care. I cleaned the house, arranged the flowers, and made tea, all the while keeping my heart open but steady. When he arrived, we talked, laughed quietly, and shared memories. The warmth was tentative but real. I realized that relationships, even strained ones, can be nurtured back to life, slowly, with gentle attention and without demands. Through all of this, I learned something essential about love and family. Love is not always loud. It does not always announce itself with grand gestures or frequent words. Sometimes it is quiet, persistent, and patient. Sometimes it is tested by neglect, distance, and misunderstanding. But even in these moments, love can endure, waiting for the opportunity to reemerge, to reconnect, and to heal hearts that have been separated by circumstance or oversight. I also learned about resilience, the quiet, uncelebrated kind that does not seek recognition. It is the kind of resilience that allows a parent to continue loving, even when that love is not returned in equal measure. It allows a person to continue finding joy in small things, in everyday rituals, and in fleeting moments of connection. It allows the heart to remain open, even when it has been hurt. By the end of this period, I felt a shift within myself. The house still had empty spaces, but I no longer felt consumed by them. The quiet that had once felt oppressive now felt like a canvas, a space where I could create moments of peace, reflection, and subtle joy. The turning point had led to an awareness that life is unpredictable, that love is sometimes unbalanced, and that the strength to endure comes from within. And so, I began to move forward, gently, calmly, and with a renewed understanding of what it means to love, to forgive, and to hold on to memories even when the present is challenging. I realized that reconciliation is not always immediate, that healing is not always linear, but that patience, openness, and quiet hope are the tools we can use to carry our hearts through the most difficult seasons of life. Time passed, gently, quietly. The house that once felt heavy with absence now carried a different weight, not emptiness, but reflection. I moved through the rooms, noticing details I had overlooked before. The sunlight painting patterns across the floor, the subtle scent of flowers, the way the wind rustled the leaves outside the window. These small things became moments of comfort, reminders that life, even in its quieter chapters, holds beauty. My children visited occasionally. The visits were short, tentative at first, but over time, they began to feel more natural. I noticed a change in my son's eyes, a softness that hadn't been there in months. My daughter-in-law, too, seemed less distant, her smiles less formal. These gestures did not erase the past, but they created small bridges over the gap that had formed between us. One evening, my grandchildren ran through the house, laughing as they chased each other. I stood by the doorway, letting the sound wash over me. For a moment, I felt the old warmth return, the simple joy of family togetherness. Fleeting, but real. I realized that life does not always return to its former shape, but it can create new shapes that are beautiful in their own way. I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Love, I understood, is patient and enduring. It is not always reciprocated in equal measure, but its value does not diminish because of that. Sometimes love is expressed through presence, sometimes through absence. Sometimes it is found in memories, letters, and photographs, or in quiet rituals like making tea, tending a garden, or walking in the morning sunlight. Forgiveness became central to my heart. I forgave my children, not because they were entirely at fault, but because holding on to resentment only weighed me down. Forgiving allowed me to open my heart, to see my family with clarity and compassion. I forgave myself, too, for the moments I might have failed or been too patient, for the times I had hoped without asking, for the expectations I had silently carried. I began to focus on what I could nurture, not what I could control. I wrote in my journal daily, documenting memories, reflections, and lessons. I spent time with friends and neighbors, finding comfort in new connections. I tended the garden, finding a quiet satisfaction in watching life grow under my care. These small acts became my anchors, grounding me when emotions swirled and bringing stability to my days. Then came another gentle moment of connection. My son visited unexpectedly, carrying a small gift for me, something he had chosen thoughtfully. "I thought you might like this," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with an openness I hadn't seen in months. I smiled quietly and accepted it without fanfare. In that exchange, I felt the possibility of healing. It was not sudden or dramatic, but it was real. I realized that reconciliation does not always come all at once. It is built slowly, through small gestures, shared moments, and quiet understanding. I learned that patience is a form of love, that waiting with an open heart is a strength, and that hope can survive, even when the present feels uncertain. The house, which had once felt cold and distant, now felt alive in a different way. It was not filled with constant chatter, but with reflection, peace, and gentle warmth. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was a space where memories could breathe, where healing could take place, and where love even quietly, could persist. I thought often about my mother, who had taught me that love endures, even when it is tested. Even if they forget, you must remember, she had said. I now understood the depth of that wisdom. I could carry love in my heart without needing constant recognition or validation. That love, patient and enduring, would sustain me through life's quiet and stormy moments alike. One morning, as I stood by the window sipping tea, I watched the sunlight spill across the garden. The flowers swayed gently, the birds sang, and I felt a calm warmth settle in my chest. My children might still be distant at times. My grandchildren might grow up and move on, and life might continue in unpredictable ways. But I had found peace. I had learned to carry love, to forgive, to remember, and to embrace each day with quiet hope. And so I live each day gently, mindfully, holding on to the memories, nurturing small joys, and opening my heart to connection, patience, and the possibility of reconciliation. Life is not perfect. Family is not always as we imagined. But love, patient, enduring, and quiet, remains. It is enough to sustain me. It is enough to carry me forward, softly, with grace, and with hope for whatever comes next.